Good morning,
Hello.
everyone. It's interesting how the last time we met, we got disconnected by an inconvenient AT&T service interruption. In a way, it was fortunate for me since even by then I was noticing, and Frank as well, that I was becoming a windbag. The break over the Labor Day weekend gave me some time to ponder Bill's previous presentation and how he described that knowledge is not wisdom. So that being said, I hope to impart some knowledge today and perhaps gain some wisdom myself throughout this presentation. It's interesting, another benefit for me of this pause is that I was finally able to finish this darn book that I started in Jamaica. Though I finished about 3/4 of it while in Jamaica, a good chunk of the day before the last presentation I tried to get through the last of it, but I still had about 20 pages left, and that was the last time I spoke to you. Forgive me, going back. As it turns out, those last few thousand words of the book were even more enlightening than the first 400, and I hope to capture at least a little bit of that in the next few minutes. Where we left off, I was talking about entropy before the Los Angeles connection dropped off. And I was trying to do this explanation, and I understand I was mangling it terribly. This thought experiment called Maxwell's demon, a subatomic imaginary thingy that sorts out slow from fast atoms. And I'll come back to entropy in a while and its mind-bending definition and see if I can do it justice. But first, I'd like to talk about memes. One chapter towards the end of the book seems somewhat wedged in, which it is, but quite frankly is relevant for my purposes here. You may recognize on the left here Richard Dawkins, and you know maybe that he is a very staunch atheist. Whatever you may think about his stance on God, he is and was very influential in another way. In his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, he wrote that, "I think a new kind of replicator, which is different from DNA and RNA, has recently emerged on this planet. It is staring us in the face. It is still in its infancy, still drifting clumsily about in its primordial soup, but already it is achieving evolutionary change at a rate that leaves the old gene panting far behind." As James Gleick writes, that soup is human culture. The vector of transmission is language, and the spawning ground is the brain. So memes, these infectious little ideas, you may recognize the one on the right for spawning lolcats. Recently I've become aware of a new meme called bandwidth poverty. And that really is the topic of my conversation in general, is this idea of maximizing bandwidth, making your life better. A recent study by researchers from Princeton University reveals that the poor face a unique cognitive tax that those who are better off do not. If you're poor, you tend to worry more and more about money constantly. I know this from personal experience, being a recent graduate from college and having to only be able to spend $20 to feed 2 people and a cat was definitely very, very tiring. And also from watching my mom while she struggled to raise both my brother and I, on a very meager income. Sandy Militanian, and I probably mispronounced his last name, but he's an economist from Harvard. He co-authored a book called Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much. He says that there are 3 types of poverty. There's money poverty, there's time poverty, and there's bandwidth poverty. And it's all about managing scarce resources. So if you're constantly thinking about money and what's happening next and borrowing time from tomorrow to do the tasks that are popping up in your head, you're going to have a lot less ability to make decisions that will affect you in the future, to read the fine print, as it were. And no wonder these predatory lending agencies tend to target the poor, because they're the ones that can't. It's not that they can't do the math or even understand that they are being gouged and have high interest rates, but at the immediate moment they need to get their car out of tow or pay the electric bill or what have you. And so in that sense, they just cannot physically calculate what the impact of the even small decisions might have on their lives. I was able to read so much of this dense book because I was mostly disconnected from the internet when I was in Jamaica, so I had much more time to read than I typically would here in the US. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a very well-established communications network there, with all the branding and the terrible customer service that we're accustomed to here in the US. Because I ran out of time before I left to research a data plan, I just resorted to turning my phone off just to not incur any charges. There was a really good bandwidth Wi-Fi at the hotel, restaurant, and bar, so a lot of us ended up spending a lot of time down there, not necessarily having drinks. We were just there for the internet. And so was everyone else at the hotel, which means that downloading large files was out of the question. So some of our work was slightly hampered because we couldn't get all of the files and we didn't bring all of them with us. So us tourists were a data-hungry bunch, and at least they'd made basic accommodations to allow us to post selfies to Facebook. Jamaicans are very cell-savvy. One lady I met told me she has 2 different phones on 2 different carriers. As far as I could tell, they were the only 2 on the island. One phone she used for texting and one for phone calls. She took advantage of each carrier's different pricing structure, which surprisingly is about the same as what I currently pay here in the US. I helped a young beekeeper and a honey entrepreneur create a business card. He insisted on listing 3 phone numbers and an email, though interestingly enough, not a specific address. They don't really have physical addresses quite yet figured out there in Jamaica, just his township he wanted to put down on his business card. My fellow project members and I tried to convince him that 3 numbers is way too much information to put on a business card, and why would you want to list all 3 anyway? He said, well, if 1 is good, 3 is better. Also, it was common for Digicel, which is one of the main carriers here, to give away your phone number. Even if you've been a great customer, no delays in payment, very solid, didn't matter to them. They were just a big corporate conglomerate. They would just take that number and assign it to somebody else. All this, with all the different numbers and then not necessarily being tied to the individual you thought, made communications very interesting, though sometimes time-consuming and even fruitless. We weren't able to get a hold of a few of the folks who we wanted to have meetings with. Bandwidth poverty is not limited to those with little financial resources. One of my favorite TLAs is TMI. TLA standing for a 3-letter acronym. This new meme came for me out, well, not necessarily the TLA, but one of my favorite shows is Portlandia. It also spouts memes on a regular basis. You may remember the Put a Bird on It meme. They recently depicted an episode where Carrie Brownstein was having a mental breakdown from too much information, Facebook, emails, LinkedIn, Twitter, all of these posts flying at her, and she decides she needs to seek help from a human bandwidth manager, if you can read that down there, who helps her to unplug. But in the process of unplugging, he shows her how lame that would be to detach from society, from collective wisdom. And he shows her the hippie granola folks, and this is now your Wikipedia, the lady who talks about her cats. And so she decides to go back online and to try to manage somehow. Coming back to the presentation that we were going through last week, let's see if I can do it justice and talk about entropy here again. It is formed from the Greek to mean transformation, content. And it is odd, contrarian, slippery concept to grasp. Entropy is not a kind of energy or an amount of energy. It is the unavailability of energy. So it's kind of trippy. This concept is a product of the science of thermodynamics, specifically as it related to the steam engine. I kind of like to say to my friends and family that heat flow is redundant because heat fundamentally is the flow of energy from one source, typically the hotter side, to the colder side. Another way, on the way moving from hot to cold, the movement, the energy does work, like hot stones dropped into water that creates steam to turn a wheel. The total energy of this closed system remains the same, but somehow work is done by, moving things and changing, doing transformation. While we can all imagine ice melting in a glass of water, it's hard to fathom, yet not impossible, if you remember from my magic talk the last time, for water to chill, crystallize, and return back to ice. It's not impossible, but it's highly improbable, even magical, you would say. Entropy is as much a physical and measurable thing as mass or temperature. The probability of a system to be better organized. Mostly it tends towards disorganization. Now back to this little demon guy. Theoretically, you can reverse time. The equations physically can change that plus or minus sign, and there's nothing to say that time couldn't go backwards. And essentially that is what James Clerk Maxwell, who thought up this thought experiment, suggested in his Theory of Heat book. After all, there are such things that are reversible in thermodynamic engine cycles especially. That's part of what I'm learning right now as I'm studying for my professional engineering exam. Heat is the motion of molecules, and if molecules behave in Newtonian ways, then every action, every collision could be calculated. But too many molecules and probabilities become too hard to handle in that mix. And Maxwell illustrated this with a thought experiment. He suggested a finite being who filters hot and cold, and yet no work is done. Only the intelligence of the very observant and neat-fingered being has been employed. To sort out hot from cold requires information, like how hot is hot and how cold is cold. Maxwell's demon became a theme, and yet, like a meme and like the game of telephone, lost its meaning along the way. People started taking it seriously rather than just this thought experiment and actually looking at the math. Speaking of losing meaning, Claude Shannon, who is the father of information theory, once said that the fundamental problem of communication is that of reproducing at one point, either exactly or approximately, a message selected at another point. Frequently, the messages have meaning. So to him, meaning got in the way. All he wanted to do was get one signal from one side of the office to the other, from one side of the continent to the other. Here he is demonstrating a maze, the first artificial intelligence, if you will, that he created with lots of little resistors and circuits and just mechanics that would learn how this little mouse would move along. And if you took those little tiles and repositioned them, it would take a little while, but it would relearn that new maze. He was always asking, what if? In 1948, at the birth of the semiconductor, he was working for the Bell Systems technical, or rather for Bell Systems, which was Ma Bell back in the day. And he wrote a very modest paper in the technical journal of the company called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. Being a telecommunication engineer, he literally was just a rocket scientist in some respect as well, because he previously worked on anti-aircraft gun automatic fire. He was a heavy thinker and deep mathematician, a code breaker literally. He worked on the Enigma project. And also he created an early version of a computer chess game, so one of the first, in fact, which he thought was sort of a silly game. Why would anyone really want to computerize chess? But yeah, he spoke to a lot of renowned chess players and made this first intelligent machine. He was also one of the first to coin the term bit, meaning a unit of measuring information. It is in no small part to his contributions to science that we now have iPhones, Google, even this GoToMeeting. The fact that we can transmit messages from one place to the other, don't care so much about what's the content of the meeting or even how they get there, but just actual math and getting the signal back appropriately. Another eminary in physics is John Archibald Wheeler, who took that idea of bit, of this measure of information, and basically coined this term from it to bit. He said, "It is not unreasonable to imagine that information sits at the core of physics, just as it sits at the core of a computer. It from bit. Otherwise put, every it, every particle, every field force, even the space-time continuum itself, derives its function, its meaning, its very entire existence, even in some contexts indirectly, from the apparatus eliciting answers to yes-no questions, binary choices, bits. It from bit symbolizes the idea that every item of the physical world has at the bottom, at the very, very deep bottom in most instances, an immaterial source of explanation. That which we call reality arises in the last analysis of the posing of a yes or no question and the registering of equipment-evoked responses. In short, that all things physical are information theoretic in origin, and that this is an anticipatory universe. Or you could say that the universe is calculating itself, it's bootstrapping itself, it is a computer and it is producing the solution. We are inundated with information. The universe is, in this respect, the it-to-bit information. In this library of Babel, all possibilities exist and all knowledge is accessible. And yet, like the ice melting and then unmelting back into ice, not all of it are probable. It's difficult sometimes to find the genuine when we're looking through all these racks and racks of knockoffs. Or if we think of the Tao Te Ching translations, some more accurate than others. Who are we to believe? When we ask questions and we have a question, back in the day we used to have this Guinness Book of World Records that would settle bar bets. And now if you need to know something, you just consult the oracle. But again, thanks to Shannon and his groundbreaking work on information theory, it is only because we can translate the physical reality of wires coming into buildings and computers processing these bits of information that you can actually have Google predict even before you finish the thought. I've had this happen recently where you typed something into the browser and it already can guess, based on all this other information that you've provided into the machine, what you might be looking for. It still may not be, at the end of the day, the right answer, but it might get you a little bit closer. Or you might find something you never expected with this I'm feeling lucky button. It's interesting, Bill's presentation earlier about unlearning. And essentially that's what entropy of the universe is, that it takes work to unlearn something, to revert to this state of more complexity, better organization. The second law of thermodynamics states that the entropy of the universe always increases. I'd like to say forgetting takes work because it just is so true. And I'm going to read you a bit of the book relating to nature. Mathematicians and logicians help develop a tendency to think of information processing as free, not like pumping water or carrying stones. In our time, it certainly has gotten very cheap, but it embodied work after all. And Bennett suggests that we recognize this work, reckon its expense and its underlying complexity. The more subtle something is, the harder it is to discover, Bennett says. He applied the idea of logical depth to the problem of self-organization, the question of how complex structures develop in nature. Evolution starts with the simple initial conditions. Complexity arises, apparently building on itself. Whatever the basic processes involved, physical or biological, something is underway that begins to resemble computation. And that's the amazing thing about computation in this Turing machine that I mentioned last time, that if you just ignore what energy it takes, going backwards, you erase the memory, essentially. You go back to a state that you forgot what disorder was. And if you've ever heard the saying, forgive and forget, you might be able to think to yourself, well, easier said than done, which is in fact true. And I think a lot of what the Tao teaches us is to not forget in the sense of the word of, I forgot my key, where I put my keys, but to integrate the knowledge that this lesson of life is teaching you. You may also have heard this saying that if there is a pattern in your life that is repeating, it's repeating for a reason, and there's a lesson in there that you need to learn. And somehow you just haven't learned it yet. And eventually when you do learn that lesson, you'll see that that pattern is stopped. It is because you've incorporated it. You haven't so much forgotten, but you've unlearned the pattern or the causes that were leading you into this loop. Chapter 48 of the Tao Te Ching tells us that to pursue knowledge is daily gain. Pursuing Tao is daily loss. Not sure about you, but for me, I found this path very fulfilling and also a way to align myself. I like to say that sometimes, with Bill, sometimes he says, the church of what's happening now, there's a lot of ungenuine tenets out there, the get-rich-quick schemes, the fad diets, the give me your money and we will send you blessings and you will go to heaven. And you won't find any of that here with the Tao, at least with our cultivation and our studies, because we're constantly, daily trying to forget, trying to declutter, trying to get back to the essence and the teachings and the genuine aspects of reality. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation. I've really enjoyed preparing these for you, but honestly, as Derek and Bill can attest, sometimes they do take a lot of work, a lot of bandwidth, and frankly need a little bit of that bandwidth as I begin my studies once again to take my professional engineering exam at the end of October. You may remember I took it last year, and unfortunately I didn't pass, so I have to reapply myself and get back to my studies. So this will be my final presentation, at least until around November, but I do enjoy them and I very much am looking forward to coming back to them. So with that, my recipe for the week is that you go and get yourself a refreshing treat to reset your memory cache, to recharge your batteries, to get ready for the week ahead of you. This is amazing ice cream that I had in Jamaica. It was a mix 50-50 of mango, on the left there, and Jamaica 50, a special flavor that they created for the Jamaica's 50th anniversary of independence, and it was pistachio with pineapple and chocolate chips. It was pretty interesting. So if you have the money and the time, take some bandwidth and go and get some ice cream this weekend. So with that, thank you everyone. I'm going to return it to Derek.